it's a great pleasure to present to all of you and tell you about the work that we've been doing for the last few years in relation to digital endpoints. There's really potentially a revolution in how we think about managing healthcare in many domains, but potentially greatest in areas of health, behavior, and experiences that are harder to pin down and measure in simple, straightforward ways. So, for example, if someone has high blood pressure, it's fairly easy to measure their blood pressure, whether it's at home or you go to the doctor or the nurse or your pharmacy and have it measured there, and you know the impact of treatment for your blood pressure. But in the areas that we're thinking of, as Beth says, support strategies for autistic people, we're first of all thinking about a wide range of behaviors, experiences, unwanted symptoms, kinds of areas that actually you'd want to develop more of, some more social contact, possibly, in some cases at least. And we've traditionally relied on asking people about their experiences, asking people who are close to them. For children and young people, it might be their parents and carers, and typically doing that when you go to see a healthcare professional. So at periodic points, and you're being asked to sum up what your experience has been over the last maybe month, 3 months, 6 months, year. And so that information obviously becomes interpreted through the lens of that individual, and it may lose some accuracy or miss some of the details. And using objective, often digital measures provides an opportunity to see whether we can get a better sort of a more precise lens on what people are experiencing, that tells us perhaps, things are getting better, they're not getting better, they're changing in particular circumstances, that's hard to capture just by personal report. And so thinking about how we might capture some of that in autism is the work that Izzy and I, with many others, have been thinking about over the last few years in Task 5. And Izzy's really going to focus on how did we go about thinking about the topic, co-producing with autistic people, some of the digital measures that we're using, and what are some of the early findings. So I'm going to turn over to Izzy.
Thanks, Emily. Almost lost the unmute button then. So thank you for this opportunity to present our work. And my first slide, I thought I'd go straight to acknowledgements, because I just wanted to acknowledge the kind of inputs that we've had from lots of different people, particularly the AREPs and other community representatives who have guided us, the LEAP study participants and data collection team, and other colleagues, for example, the Radar team, who developed the main platform that we've used to implement. And also to Pierre and Yanea, who have particularly had some input on these slides. Emily has situated the work nicely, but just to recap, within the scope of the wider research programme, aims to trials priorities include understanding and characterising diversity within the autism spectrum, and developing evidence-based support for characteristics or experiences that might cause distress during everyday life, for example, mental health problems and disrupted sleep. But in order to assess whether a support is working, we need to be able to measure these outcomes of interest kind of accurately, precisely, and with minimal impact on everyday life. And as Emily said, typically clinical outcome measures that we use are either questionnaires or reports made by individuals themselves, parents and carers or teachers, or they are clinician or researcher administered interviews or observations. And both of these methods are based on human judgment about complex behaviours and experiences. And there is therefore potential for subjectivity, bias. There may be low agreement across raters and contexts, for example, home and school. And it is difficult for humans to pick up on some of the very fine-grained differences or changes in behaviour, or at least to capture these within rating scales. And finally, often observations are conducted in one-off, unfamiliar situations that could increase anxiety and affect people's behaviour ultimately. So how else might we address these issues of measurement? So one way could be to explore digital technologies like smartphones and wearable devices, which are commonly used in today's society. And they could provide more objective data that is highly precise. So that means they can detect very small differences. And data can be collected passively without the user needing to do anything. So in that sense, it might provide measures with low burden for participants, and that in turn would mean that we can capture data for longer periods of time in everyday life, and collect data on larger samples, potentially including individuals who might find it more difficult to attend a research visit. So although these devices are being used more and more in health research in general, we have a limited understanding currently of how useful they might be in autism research. So would they be usable, acceptable? Would they produce meaningful data? These are some of the questions that we're interested in. So on to the specific aims of this research project. We're talking today about our remote measurement project. We do also have a kind of parallel in-person project, but we decided to focus on the remote aspects for this talk. So the aims of this are firstly to develop a remote measurement system that is broadly appropriate for autistic adult and adolescent smartphone users and that captures meaningful data relevant to the outcomes or domains of interest, like things like we mentioned, sleep, mental health, social functioning in everyday life. So, for example, access to school and work, participation in social or community activities, and relationships with family and friends. And importantly, we wanted to evaluate its acceptability, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And finally, we wanted to explore the data that we got from these smartphones and wearables, and test whether it is actually meaningful and usable. So just to show an overview of the project as a whole, at the beginning of the project, we talked to a variety of autism community representatives, including some AREPs, about our technologies of interest. So we asked their views on opportunities and potential pitfalls, and how we might implement this kind of thing in a way that's acceptable to autistic people. And then we developed and piloted the remote measurement system based on this guidance. We collected our data using that system with participants from the Longitudinal European Autism Project. And we're currently at the stage of analysing and evaluating the system. And when the project comes to an end, we're hoping to present on some candidate tools. So I'll go through the slides and they roughly follow this timeline. So at the start of the project, we went in with some ideas about which technologies we'd like to explore based on existing research. And firstly, that covered wearable devices. So these come in many different forms, but essentially they're devices worn on the body that can pick up physiological data like movement, heart rate, electrodermal activity, and a whole host of other possibilities. And secondly, we are interested in smartphones. So with some obvious, well, important exceptions, smartphones have become very widely used, and people often carry them about on their person. So they're promising candidates for use as both a device for active reporting, and also a device for collecting data about everyday behaviour and nearby environments. So as depicted here with some data sources that I'll go into a bit later. So to put this into a framework, we're interested in how information from these data sources could be combined to provide meaningful insight into the characteristics of interest. So I've listed some of these across the middle here and linked them kind of hypothetically to our data sources. So firstly, our passive or objective data from smartphones and wearable devices. So for example, sleep disruption might be shown in data that we get from on sleep pattern from a wearable device. It might be shown in smartphone and app use and or light levels that a smartphone would be able to detect. And secondly, our active report data could also kind of allow people to efficiently report about their sleep quality with minimal recall effects. So back at the beginning of the project, those were our kind of ideas about potential devices and how they might provide useful data. But we didn't know how best to implement that in a system that people would find acceptable and usable, and what people's attitudes to this kind of data collection might be. So therefore, we invited community representatives, including some AREPs, to discuss this. And we ended up speaking to 12 autistic adults, 6 parents or carers of autistic people, and 4 autistic adolescents. And this was during the pandemic, so it was all online. So we held several small focus groups, and then others contributed either one-to-one via Zoom or by email. And here are a very small sample of the kinds of input that they had onto our eventual protocol. So there's lots of rich input that we received, and these are just a few examples. So firstly, there was concern that these types of passive data collection, in which large amounts of personal, well, potentially sensitive information is collected from people's phones, and that could feel invasive. And people would want to know exactly what is being collected, how it's being managed and kept safe, and why, and what might be the benefit for autistic people. So therefore, we designed a kind of extended participant information process that involved several stages and with time in between for people to kind of think it over and ask questions. And we also provided information in different formats. So for example, we designed a participant handbook that showed things in a more comprehensive and visual way. Secondly, people told us that in order to be acceptable to wear during everyday life, wearables would need to not draw unwanted attention. They'd need to allow for individual sensory preferences and to not look or feel too kind of medical, like with wires and sticky pads and things. So based on this, we chose a Fitbit, which is a commonly used commercial device, and it can be worn with a variety of straps. And finally, given that we are trying to develop objective measures, our advisors wanted us to avoid kind of inadvertently introducing neurotypical biases, and therefore wanted the autism community to be involved kind of at later stages as well. So based on all of this input, we developed what we called the Mobile Measures Month. And this involved participants being invited to wear a Fitbit for as much of the time as possible for 28 days. And also to download and use 3 smartphone apps, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And 2 of those apps were developed by researchers at King's College London called the Radar team. And they've developed a platform that kind of enables collecting passive and active data remotely from smartphones and wearables, and also infrastructure supporting data management and processing. And we also collected interview feedback at the end of the month to capture people's experiences of the data collection. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about each component. And firstly, the Fitbit, and we chose the Inspire 2 model. And the benefits of using a Fitbit include the fact that it's widely used, it's relatively unobtrusive and lightweight, and it also has lots of different straps that you can use, so individuals could kind of choose a strap that suits them. But it does come with some limitations. There are better sensors available. For example, a Fitbit doesn't detect heartbeats directly. It uses an indirect method. So if you're interested in very intricate analyses on heart rate, it might not be as good as some other devices. And also Fitbit only provides data processed by their own algorithms, so that limits what we're able to explore in the data. Moving on to our smartphone apps, the first that I'll tell you about is one of the Radar apps. It's their passive data collection app. So this collects data from smartphone logs and sensors, and that includes call and messaging logs, light levels, things like light levels that could tell us about sleep habits, number of nearby Bluetooth enabled devices that could hold information about types of environment that people visit, smartphone and app usage, and finally location and activity data. It has kind of a simple interface that participants don't really need to interact with. In theory, it simply sits on your phone and collects data in the background. But again, it does come with some issues. So firstly, it's only compatible with Android smartphones, which excludes around half the population of smartphone users. Secondly, all of its kind of background data collection does use up quite a lot of battery life and processing power. So some models of phone can have battery issues with the app. And although the interface isn't designed to be used as such, some participants found it confusing. We also needed to commission a custom build of the app because the standard app no longer collects some of the data that we considered to be most interesting in this context. And of course, as mentioned, all this data being collected could feel intrusive. So the benefits of passive objective data collection are kind of tied to people's awareness of it. If people are very aware of that data being collected, they might change their behaviour, which could affect measurement. And that's something that we explored further in our feedback interviews. Throughout this, we thought it was important to kind of get across the kinds of technical issues that we navigated through the project. Moving on to our active data collection apps, the first of these is also developed by the Radar team. It enables participants to receive notifications and respond to questions according to a preset schedule. So we used the app to ask people each morning about how they slept through the night before. And I've just got a quick clip here showing the notification and going into the app to answer the question. Clicking start brings you to the question itself, where I've rated my sleep. I think this was back before I had a child, so I've given myself a whopping 62 out of 100 there, and then you get a nice tick to say that you've completed the tasks. We also used this app to administer questions on attention and activity levels, and also social communication questions. Our final app that we used is called My Journey, and this is an app that was co-designed by researchers in our department and local secondary school pupils for use in monitoring mental health in schools. And we kind of co-opted the mood logging component of this app for our study. So here, participants would receive a notification up to twice a day to complete a mood and context log. So it takes you through a series of questions about what you're up to at the moment, how you're feeling, and then it gives you a number of kind of mood descriptors that you can rate using a sliding scale. It also has a little purple bean character that kind of tries to depict the emotion that's being described. And then it gives you a summary of how you described your mood in that moment. Sorry. Okay, so those are all the components that people were using throughout the month. And at the end of the month, we administered some quantitative and qualitative feedback via questionnaires and a semi-structured interview. The interviews were online and typically lasted 45 minutes to an hour, and they were recorded and transcribed. And our interview topics were guided by the community involvement discussions that we had at the beginning of the study and by some existing research. And the topics included the information and enrolment process because of what people told us about how they'd want this to look. Overall experience, so what was the impact on people's daily lives, how they found the active reporting, so how did they find the schedule, were the timings fitting in with their everyday life, how did they find the Fitbit, so how comfortable was it, how usable was it, and finally, how did they find this concept of a passive data collection app, so were they very aware of it, did they have data privacy concerns. And all of this data collection was in the Longitudinal European Autism Project. So for anyone who's not familiar with LEAP, this is a large sample of autistic and non-autistic volunteers from sites across Europe who were recruited back in 2014. And we came in at wave 3, which was almost 10 years later. And it also started during the pandemic. So there are some lower numbers returning at this wave. And we then further applied our specific eligibility criteria. So participants had to be contactable at wave 3. We were only able to include UK sites because we didn't really have the resources to translate all of the apps into different languages. And yeah, we only included people aged 12 years plus, and they had to be an independent user of their own Android smartphone. So these criteria obviously cut down the number of participants who were eligible to take part, and that might have implications for the representativeness of the data we have. So people might like to discuss that later. And then moving on to some results. So here we can see some pie charts showing our eligibility, uptake, and completion rates. So at the KCL site, the King's College London site, which is where we did most of our data collection, we had 82 participants who were contactable and who were screened for eligibility, and half were eligible. The main reason for not being eligible was being an iPhone user. And next we have data on uptake. So this is how many participants actually consented to take part after going through our information processes. And nearly 80% of those participants consented. Of those who didn't, around 5 had either seemed to lose interest or became unresponsive after their initial screening. 3 felt like that the active components of the month, like completing mood logs every day, would be too much for them. And then 1 declined because they had data privacy concerns. I'm going to mention at this point that the ways in which we implemented screening was a bit different for participants at the Cambridge site and also participants with an intellectual disability. So those participants aren't included in these pie charts, but I've included them here alongside a number of iPhone users who we invited at a later stage to kind of boost our numbers in the components that they were able to do. So that was the active reporting and the Fitbit components. So that's why we have an additional 18 participants consenting here, that feeds into the overall 48 participants who took part. And of all of those who were enrolled in the study, there was only one participant who discontinued during the month, so they were unable to continue. And that was due to a variety of reasons, but mostly a kind of difficulty with logging into the apps that we weren't able to resolve whilst communicating remotely with them. So next, I'm presenting some results for adherence to the active questionnaires. So this is asking how much of the active reporting were people able to complete. And here I've used our sleep quality question as an example because this was administered every day, each morning. And each of these blue bars represents one participant, and the height of the bar represents the number of entries that they were able to complete. And the green dashed line represents the maximum number that they could have completed, which is 28, so one per day. So these kind of 10 or so participants at the far left here were able to complete it every day. And I've kind of added this blue box to show that over half of the participants were able to complete that question the vast majority of days, so only missing a couple of days. And then I've added a kind of orange section here to show the remaining participants for whom their completion was less, and sliding down to kind of participants over this side of the chart who were only able to complete a few of the sleep questions. So overall, this seems to be something that most people were able to work into their everyday routine, but was more problematic for others. Here I'm moving on to adherence to the Fitbit, so wearing the Fitbit. How much were people able to wear the Fitbit during the month? And I'm going to talk you through, so we're going to zoom in on one of these charts. And here, this whole plot is representing just one participant. The x-axis here is showing the timeline through the 28 days. And each thin kind of vertical line represents a 2-hour window in which the Fitbit was worn. And the gaps represent where data weren't available. So the green lines are representing daytime hours, and red are representing nighttime hours. So zooming back out to show the different patterns that we saw, and this is quite an informal look at these at this stage. We haven't done a formal analysis of this, but we have noticed plots falling into 4 main patterns. So in the top left here, we've got roughly 64% of participants seem to have quite a high adherence. So they're able to wear the Fitbit pretty much all the time, with potentially some gaps, for example, to charge the device. Moving on to the top right quadrant, we've got participants who were predominantly able to wear the device during the day, and we've got gaps where the nighttime would be. And we heard this in the interviews as well. A certain number of participants definitely fed back that they found the Fitbit uncomfortable to wear at night, but they were happy to wear it during the day. Then in the bottom left, we've got participants who seem to be able to wear the Fitbit a lot to begin with, but then at some point during the month didn't want to wear it anymore or couldn't. And then finally over here, we've got 15% of participants who only were able to wear the device for a short period of time. So that was a snapshot of our quantitative data. I'm moving now to talk briefly about our qualitative data and how we're processing it. So I don't have really time to explain all of these stages, but I just wanted to highlight that we're using a technique called framework analysis, which lends itself to community involvement at key stages, so such as developing a working analytical framework for coding. So we've involved some AREPs at this stage, and then when we come later to interpreting the summarized data, that's another point at which we can involve AREPs. So thinking about kind of the themes that might come out of the data. To talk a bit more about framework development. So an important part of framework analysis is how you develop your framework. And we started out from kind of basic principles shown in prior literature in other populations. So here are themes such as usability, convenience and utility, and motivation. And they're important factors that shape kind of people's experience with digital health related data collection in general. And we then applied additional points raised by community representatives at the beginning of the project that might give us more insight into issues important to autistic people. So, for example, the study information processes, device comfort, including sensory sensitivities, and so on. When it came to coding, we used inductive or open coding for the first few interviews to try to pick up any other important factors that were emerging in our particular study. And this included some additional points on motivation. We picked up a lot of diversity in how people described their personal contexts and how that influenced how they experienced the month. And we've got some other things on predictability, the passive app design, and we also picked up some interesting codes on how people kind of actively worked this month into their usual routine. Sorry. I don't know if you can still see my screen, but it just has switched off briefly. It'll come back in a minute. Finally, we took these kind of initial framework development ideas to our AREPs, and they gave us some specific input on that. I don't know. Can anyone tell me if you can still see
Yes,
my slides?
can.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just me who can't. That's fine. Okay, yeah, so finally, yeah, we discussed the working framework with two AREPs who kind of broadly agreed with our framework, but highlighted a couple of additional points. So just to pick up on these here, they had some particular input on our motivation codes and the role of executive function demands versus needs. So briefly, they wanted us to code and be receptive to picking up on data that could help us understand drivers for participants to enroll and to continue participating throughout the month. And they also wanted us to code data that could help us understand the additional load on executive function that participating in the study could place on an individual, and how their needs were kind of accommodated or potentially challenged by the study. We're coming to the end of our time, but I just wanted to mention our planned next steps that include exploring the associations between the uptake and adherence data that you've seen and some other data, but so the relationship between that and participant characteristics that might have an influence on how people were able to adhere, for example, during the month. We also need to code the remaining interviews and interpret this data with the help of our AREPs. We're beginning to, explore, we're beginning to explore the kind of utility and meaningfulness of the data in key domains. So for example, in the domain of sleep, we've started to look at associations between passive objective data, so from the Fitbit and from the smartphone, and from people's daily ratings of the sleep quality. So for each domain of interest, we need to kind of understand how our new measures map onto the more conventional measures and what extra insight they might give us. At this point, I'm going to say thank you for listening, and I'm going to leave you with a slide developed by our AREPs, Yanea and Pierre, who came up with some potential points for further discussion, but obviously people might have questions of their own. I don't know how we're doing for time. I feel like we might have enough time for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Izzy. Yeah, we definitely have time for questions and discussion. Emily, is there anything else you wanted to add before we move to Q&A?
No, that's brilliant, Izzy. Thank you so much for that really clear presentation.
Thanks.
I agree.